Hi, Primas. I'm Roxy,
And I'm Giselle.
and this is the For Las Primas podcast. Welcome back.
Welcome back, everyone. Today's episode is a really special one because we're joined by an incredible guest, Dr. Lisette Sanchez.
Dr. Sanchez is a first-gen psychologist whose work centers around healing, identity, and the emotional weight so many of us first-gen carry, especially as a strong one in our families.
We talk about her upbringing, her journey into psychology, and the powerful article that landed her a feature on Oprah titled, "Why Being the Strong One is a Form of Self-Sabotage."
This conversation is honest, validating, and deeply needed, especially for primas who have been holding it together for way too long.
So grab your cafecito, get comfortable, and let's get into it.
Lisette, we are so excited to have you on the pod. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Roxy. I'm so excited to be here with both of you and to just hang out, chismear.
Laugh about all the things that we have in common. We want to hear about you,
Mhm.
your parents' story of coming to the US and how your experience has been. So tell us a little bit about that. Where are you from? Where are your parents from?
So I grew up in California. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley since second grade, but I was born in LA. We moved to the Valley to be closer to my grandma because she was our primary caregiver. So when my mom and dad would go to work, I'd go with my abuelita, right? So she lived around the corner from us, which honestly was such a special experience, I think, to have growing up. My parents are immigrants from Mexico and El Salvador. And often, families can get split. It can be a bit challenging. But for me, I got both of my grandmas in just different ways. So my mom's mom was around the corner, and my dad's mom was 3 hours away driving. And so we'd spend every Christmas there with her and my grandfather too. I'm the eldest daughter, and growing up came with a lot of responsibilities. A lot of, I think, cultural expectations when it came to being a woman. What it looked like from even very young, the message around like your needs are not as important as someone else's needs, especially if it's a male in the family. So I have a cousin who's just slightly younger than I am. And as a kid, my grandmother, if my cousin wanted to play with one of my toys, it was like, yeah, well, you're the older one and he's a boy. So you give it to him if he asks you for something, right? So learning that very early on, but this is how my grandmother was raised, right? That's sort of the expectations they had. So I experienced a lot of that, and being the oldest, put me in the position of translating, of helping my family, stepping into these adult roles really early on. I talk about it in my work, how these early roles really help shape leadership skills for first gen. So like I definitely prepared me for the work that I do. And there's an and, right? Like you get a lot, and there's
Capital letters.
big and, right? Prepares you and scars you a little bit. There's some of these experiences that we have to like learn how to work through. And so that's part of what shaped the passion for the work that I do. But yeah, there's a lot about my childhood that I think back to and wish so much that I could go back. And I'm sure many of us first gen feel like, let's go back and talk to that little version, that young version of ourselves. It's like it all works out. You're fine.
It's
But like
insane how that happens too. And
yeah.
like Giselle and I were also both raised by our grandmothers. Latino culture is like very patriarchal, but somehow we were raised in these matriarchies that just like upheld the patriarchy, which was like really ironic. But being raised by like really strong women who put so much pressure on us because that's the pressure they were given, like that is such a real thing. And the privileges that we have now, and thinking back to like that little girl and like, what was your grandma going through? How was she
Yeah.
raised? What was your mom's experience, right? Like those things really start to come up.
Yeah, and that trend on social media was like, she's just a girl, or they're just a boy. And I'm like, and I'm already a llorona. So yeah, she's just a girl. Love how you phrase that because it's a reality. It's like with such a patriarchal values being reinforced or being raised in the matriarch, right? By very strong women. And that eldest daughter who took care of everyone. But I mean, I've always just had such a nurturing personality, and that's what's led to my primary career of being a psychologist, where I intuitively, because I'm so empathetic, can really understand the depth of the experience that someone is having,
Mhm.
and it's a big strength for the work that I do. Like I will never say that I know what it's like to have lived all these experiences that I haven't, but I can have a deeper understanding than someone who doesn't have this level of empathy.
Yeah, of course, of course. There's like a collective understand like baseline
Yeah.
almost of that we could all understand. Um, that's amazing. So growing up in LA, like there's a big Mexican American community. Were you it was that like the vibe when you were going to elementary school, high
Yeah.
school?
Yeah, that was exactly it, and so, I grew up in an apartment building, 47 apartments, my parents still live there. A lot of times I'm like, You don't need to live there," but this is where they're comfortable. It wasn't the safest neighborhood growing up. It's okay now. Now it's just familiar, right? We know everyone, but the whole neighborhood is like a little barrio in terms of like this Mexican enclave is sort of what I refer to it as. So, in my apartment building, we had, there was a lot of other families that lived in different apartments and they would have their own businesses. And so, la tiendita del apartamento 12 or whatever, where my dad would be like, ve, cómprame una soda, mija. And I'd go to apartment, there. And so like it felt like a big community in that way. And so I was raised around a lot of people who looked like me, a lot of people who had similar traditions. I think two people had their quinceañeras in like the little area within the apartments just because there were so much, like, I guess that so many families that were together. So, and it's always loud. Even now when I visit, my husband will go and he's like, it's so loud at your parents' house. And I'm like, because everyone's got their doors open, their music on, their shows on super loud. And that's just how it was growing up. And so same for the schools that I was at because of the neighbor, you go into the schools based on your neighborhoods. And so everywhere I went was predominantly Latino, predominantly Mexican. However, since I was in second grade, speaking Spanish in these spaces was highly discouraged unless you were in a Spanish class, right? I remember getting in trouble when I was little, or speaking Spanish, which, for a time there, I was so excited when I saw people taking their kids to these language, cultural immersion schools, and now seeing sort of this shift back to this discomfort with using these other languages in classrooms.
Well, if it's any consolation, my son is in a Spanish immersion school, and there's like so much interest, at least here among like my friends, for their kids to speak more languages if possible. So, where the resistance, the more languages, the better, honestly. What was like a time, or when did you first? Because growing up, like you have that moment where you're like the other kind of, right? Like you whether you have it as a child or as a teenager or maybe college, like did you have that moment where you were like, "Whoa, like maybe I this isn't the norm for this
Yeah.
isn't."
Yeah, because like I said, I was very much protected in that, every one of my friends had strict parents. Every one of my friends, their experiences were the same. We all had the same obligations, expectations. We are all going to misa on Sunday morning. And so I'd say my biggest culture shock was when I went to college.
Mm,
Because that's when I first started, and not just beyond just like the different cultures. I remember at like the more introductory level, the foods, right? Being introduced to different foods because growing up, like hay comida en la casa, right? Always, hay comida en la casa. So I'm eating, Salvadorian food, Mexican food, occasionally, my dad used to work in the cafeteria at the police academy. And so he would bring different meals for us. And so I would try different things. And so through that, like pasta. I know it seems like such a silly thing, but my first memory of having like fettuccine was because my dad brought it home from work and he told me what it was. And so then one time when our teachers, for people who like placed or won something in 8th grade, they took us to lunch at BJ's. And for me, BJ's was the fanciest restaurant ever because I mean, I'm sitting down, someone takes my order. I remember mentally preparing, like, I'm going to have to order something at this restaurant. And I don't know if you had this experience first time you go to a restaurant, but for me, I was like, I looked at the menu and I was like, I was like so anxious, but I saw fettuccine alfredo and I'm like, I know that because my dad brought that home once, and so I'm gonna order that. And so just even just what you wouldn't think of a culture shock was a culture shock for me because of the way that I was raised. So, but I felt it especially when I went to college, because at college, suddenly I was no longer just surrounded by everyone who looked like me or who had the same lived experiences and different traditions, different expectations. And even when I would meet other Latinas, some of them had just different rules in their household. Like they'd say, "Oh, Lisette, you got to tell your parents that they can't call you every day and you can't talk to them every day." And I'm like, "How did you do that? I'm so scared. I'm so scared of setting those boundaries with my family." And so I think being there, noticing those differences, feeling othered, and being in more of a minority. There were a lot of microaggressions that I experienced, but I didn't have the language for that at the time. There were a lot of moments where I felt uncomfortable, where I felt that I was being dismissed, where something just felt off. But I
Mm.
hadn't learned what microaggressions were, right? The constant, like, "Oh, your English is so good," or, like really small comments where you're like, "That doesn't sound like a compliment, but I guess, thanks," right? And I'm a kid. I'm just a kid, right? And so the otherness continued as I continued with my education, because every level that you go up in education, there's less and less people of color. And so I felt it the most intensely when I got to my PhD program, because at this point I went for my PhD. Yes, but I went
Yes.
for that. I went to Oregon, and I don't know if either of you have spent time
No.
there. It's a beautiful state. So let me start with, if you love outdoors, beautiful state. It's like nature. It was also the least diverse place I've ever
Very white.
lived in.
Very
Yeah,
white.
least
Mhm.
diverse place. And so when I first arrived there were microaggressions left and right. My roommate, she's from New Mexico, and the amount of times that people disconnected that New Mexico is a state in the US when they would ask her where she was from. They're like, "Oh, where in Mexico is that?" And we're like, it's a state in America, like, it's here, right? It's here. But because they looked at us, we didn't fit their perspective of what an American should look like, and so it just couldn't make sense of it. So I experienced a lot of that outwardly and within the academic institutions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. The higher up you go, the less minorities you see. Like that's so true. And I feel like that academia too is can be so challenging because it's so I have a lot of opinions at academia from my master's program, but it's so privileged in that it's just set in theory and like not necessarily practice. So people
Yeah.
don't really get out there and it can be really isolating. Um that's
Yeah.
crazy, the New Mexico thing too.
I know that one.
All they heard was Mexico and they were like, "What?"
It's always interesting, like, to think back on our first experiences of otherness. Giselle and I definitely explore that and have explored that. For me, it definitely happened in college, and I sort of didn't have the language till I was, like, 32 to start talking about these things when I really was like, "Wait, I am, like, I belong from in 2 places." Like, I'm so glad that we have the language now. I'm so glad that there's more Latinas like you, Lisa, in the psychology space. There's such a movement now within the Hispanic community that everybody's like, wait, like we need to talk about this because we need younger generations to feel comfortable, especially in this political climate that doesn't really embrace the diversity that we bring. But
Yeah.
it's really cool just to see the conversation shift and to think that what could have how could have things been different if we had this language when we were going through these experiences as young women, right?
I'll
Go.
tell you that one of the reasons that I chose to specialize in this, in like with Burgerverse Gens, working with folks that feel like we're ni de aquí ni de allá, is because I started noticing the stories were not changing, right? Where I was hearing the same stories that I have. I was hearing it in the students that I was working with. I was working at universities where, and I remember sitting there. This was shortly after I became a licensed psychologist. I'm sitting with a client. She's first gen, Latina, daughter of immigrants. And I swear to both of you, I was sitting there and I like listening to everything she's telling me, and I'm seeing a past version of myself, a version of myself that's brave enough to go to therapy, though. Like, I'll give her that. She was in this room with me, but also because I was there, because now you have access to a therapist who looks like you, has some of these lived experiences. We don't have to explain why family feels so hard to set a boundary with, right? So I sat with her and then I thought, here, provided resources, and this is the time. I don't know if you know anyone in colleges right now, but many colleges now have like first gen centers, like first gen spaces and
Oh,
resources,
wow.
and have started to create more. So when I saw that, I'm like, oh, that's great. In addition to usually, again, like I think they've been changing the names of all of these because of the funding, but like the Chicano, Latina centers, like, and so spaces where people can really understand more of their culture and have people bring up these conversations and challenge this idea, right? But then you left college and you graduated and you go into the workforce and there's nothing. You like unless a corporation or wherever you work has an ERG or has something in place. And if they do, they might have it for like a women's ERG, maybe an ethnic minority ERG, but I don't know that I've ever encountered a first gen ERG anywhere, right? And so a big part of my work was like, I'm seeing the story repeat because there are still places where people don't have access to resources, where that stigma still continues and that pattern is repeating. One person, but there's so many of us doing this work, and to begin to shift that narrative to give people spaces. So all of my clients in my practice are first gen. They're not all Latina, but they are all first gen, and they all have similar challenges. And we talk through and work through them, and so I could talk about that forever. So I'm gonna stop there. Yeah.
I love the example that you brought up of like, why don't you tell your parents to stop calling you every day? Because something so small like that, like I did go to my campus therapist. I'm having a flashback right now. So sorry. I'm like,
Oh no,
you're
sure.
giving me, this is my personal
You're in a
therapist
trance
session.
right now.
I haven't thought about college in a long time, but I did go to my like the center that was available. Everybody was white. And so I do remember feeling overwhelmed by the guilt that I felt. I went to college 5 hours away from home. I had a little nephew. I felt a lot of guilt around leaving my family. And my parents would call me every day. I was also partying. I was doing things that I knew were not what my parents would want me to do. And I just had so much internal conflict. I remember going to therapy and talking about some of the behaviors that were so normal for me and my family. And I remember my therapist telling me, like, I recommend taking space from your family. And I was like, okay. And I went back to my dorm, and I think that was an experience that sort of made me not wanna go to therapy anymore because I can't do that. I can't separate from my family because I love my family. I just need to find a way to deal with it. Having a first gen center in a college setting is so important because I lost my way a lot in college, and it was because I was so confused about who I was, you know?
Yeah. I remember when I was in school, we learned about um, our brain development. And so we reference this age up until I think it's 35 as emerging adulthood because our brains are still forming. But I think there was an article that I saw that went viral that was like, your brain is not formed until you're 35. You're still a teenager until then. But I think that's how they phrased it. And I laugh, but I'm like, but really though, like it's really the experience. Like we are still learning, we are still growing into into who we are. And when we have been the adult already, it's finding
Mm,
spaces that where we can receive some of the mentorship or the guidance or just some consejos to be like, well, how do I actually navigate this? It's having access to more mental health and just general information that's more relevant and rooted in our cultura, is what I'm trying to say.
yeah,
Rooted in
yeah,
our cultura, and that makes a huge difference.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's super important. My like thinking back on my college experience, luckily I had like a group of friends that we just all kind of just like migrated towards each other and like we're still good friends to this day, but we all were like first gen or like immigrants from a very young age that like you're basically first gen at that point. But and then we just like all leaned on each other for support, but having a center like that would have been really helpful, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, because now as adults, that's what we're seeking. Giselle and I had a whole episode about we don't really know how to find our community when we live in predominantly white areas. And so how can we find that and how can we nurture that? And that was sort of part of why we started the podcast. We're like,
Yeah,
well, let's start the space here and see where it leads us, right? So it is so important to have that
yeah.
community.
Yeah, especially when that's a big value that we're raised with or raised with collectivistic values. And so, like, we thrive with community. And so, in a lot of the talks that I do when I'm speaking with organizations, I remind people like community it's not weakness because sometimes we get into our minds like, oh, if I have to ask for help, then that means that there's something wrong with me. It's like no, community is strategy. When we come together, right, we're healing ourselves and we're healing our community because I don't know about you all, but when I see collectives are what help create bigger change, even in the smallest communities.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Um, I wanna pivot a little bit.
Okay.
I wanna talk about your article that you published called "Why Being the Strong One is a Form of Self-Sabotage" that appeared on Oprah Daily. Is
Yes,
that right?
yes, that's yeah, that one.
Congratulations.
Um,
That's exciting.
Thank you. When I pitched it, I was like, "We'll see what happens." I was so busy, but I had this idea and I was like, "I'm just gonna pitch myself. Let's see how it goes." And then they replied to me the next day. They're like, "We are accepting your pitch. You have a deadline of 2 weeks from now." And I was like, "Oh my." And it was right before like 4th of July and I was traveling. My husband had broken his ankle. We're traveling and I'm his caregiver right now, right? We're traveling. He's in a wheelchair. I'm having to be strategic about all these things in between moments on the flight or it was a family reunion or in between things, I'm like, I gotta work on this article. This article is due. Like, I gotta get this done. I want to share that because it's sometimes, our path to the dreams, like, isn't always the easiest or most like clear path. I was in a very vulnerable place writing it. And it wasn't about being the strong one and getting it through. And I did lean on supports in other ways, right? My husband could not walk properly, but he could certainly edit. I was like, I'm gonna send this to the other editor before I do that. Can you look at this? And
That whole story is so important because one of my questions to you was like, if people have an idea but they feel stuck, what do you recommend for them? To your point, you pitched it, you got it, and you're like, "Oh
Mhm.
shit, it's due. I got to do this," right? So I'm hearing like just do it, right? Like just go for it.
Yeah, I always say, it's action. In the communities I'm working with, we're waiting for this perfect moment sometimes, whether it's for ourselves to arrive in a perfect space, like, I'm now a good writer, I'm now, or it's this, unrealistic expectation that you have of, I need to be confident before I can do any of these things,
Mm.
and I don't know how you both feel or define confidence, but for me, confidence isn't something that you have, it's something you act on and you develop and you grow. Your confidence grows through your actions. I think like I love that I get to be on your podcast and that we get to have these conversations. And I remember the first podcast that I was on, it was the most nerve-wracking process for me. I was so nervous. I don't know how many times I said all of my filler words because I was like heart rate the whole time. But it was an opportunity, and I oftentimes we're the first ones to limit ourselves. So don't limit yourself in that way. Try it. And sometimes people don't do it because we're afraid of rejection. Rejection is scary, and I get that, especially when you're someone who's been raised into believing that failure is not an option. When you're filling out really important government forms or you're translating at a medical appointment and you understand how important what you're saying is, and if you make a mistake, it could actually have consequences for someone's life. We end up carrying that with us, and we believe every other failure can be life-threatening to someone, and so needing to let go of that and recognizing that failure is a part of how we learn, how we navigate the world. I don't think of failure in that way anymore. I now call any failure, any rejection, anything that I get, I put it in my email, I have a folder that I called "Not Yet." And so every time a rejection comes in or whatever, because I am constantly pitching myself. I'm trying. I'm like, let's see what happens. And anytime something comes in, I'm like, you know what? This is just not yet. Doesn't mean not ever. It's just not yet, not now. And when I'm ready, I can go and submit again, or I can try again because that's really how the world works. You just try again, or pivot if you find that maybe this isn't really what I want.
Yeah, the perfectionism is real. Giselle and I are hardcore perfectionists, I would say.
I know. I was just like thinking what you were saying about the fear of failure. And I talked about this with my therapist too,
Yeah.
like about how we just have this giant fear of failure. I'm also the eldest daughter and first gen.
Yeah, and I wanna say what failure truly is when we're limiting ourselves, when we're not trying or not chasing
Mhm.
a dream that we have. When I was younger, I would be frustrated when I would recognize that I have more barriers than some of my peers
Yeah.
who maybe had more resources or more access, and I wanna say that comparison is a trap. It's such a trap because it's so unfair. It is unfair. It is unfair. Let me just say it is unfair. It is an unfair field that you are playing. And I think of this image that I saw once where it's like a track and like people are like, you got to get to the end. It's a race. And then there's one person's lane who has like, like one barrier after another one and someone's is clear, right? Like, of course I want the clear lane. Like, I don't want to have to go through all of this, but this is the path that I have. This is the path that I'm on. And so all I can do is navigate one barrier after the next one because I know that the end is still there. Maybe it'll take me longer. Maybe along the way I'll find a different path that, actually fits more of what I'm looking for, but it's so important to not let those barriers discourage you from following your dreams and to not let the fact that it's going to be harder discourage you because I don't know about you two, how your careers have felt, but I'm like, it was not easy to become a
Wow,
psychologist. I was like, it's not easy.
Mm.
Um,
none of
Oh,
it
I know. I
feels
just made my first student loan payment. I almost
hey,
cried.
No, it's definitely not or when you overcome something and you start to see yourself moving forward in significant ways, there's no better feeling for me than how proud I am, and you're so right. My best friend tells me this all the time, "Comparison is a thief of joy." Where are you now? And, like, where did you come from? Because where you came from is much different from, like, where someone else maybe is to where they came from. Their leap might be this big, whereas your leap has been huge.
yeah,
And so I think as first gen, that's one thing we always have to remember is like most of our parents came here with nothing. We did not come from very wealthy backgrounds and we're making something of ourselves and maybe we're not like super wealthy and like have achieved like the American dream according to what our parents think, but we've made it so far and feeling
yeah.
really proud of that, I think is um hard to remember sometimes, but like celebrating the small wins, right? It's all about that. Um and I wanna dig in a little bit into your article about being the strong one because like we said, we were raised by really strong women. I didn't really see my mom break down. I didn't see my grandma break down. They were very strong. They cooked, they cleaned, they didn't complain, they did it all. And here I am, to your point earlier, I feel like a teen mom sometimes. I'm like, how am I in this situation? Which I'm an adult, obviously, but I feel like it's hard to do it all, whereas this previous generation did it all and didn't complain. So like tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write the article and some of the points that you made in there.
Yeah. So I think it was more to challenge this perception of like we have to be the strong ones, especially as women. And I want to make sure there's a distinction between this how I'm talking about it now, when we're talking about the older generation, there was a lot of pride in the way that they like served family or the way, the work that you do. I think of like my maternal grandmother. So I got 11 children. And remember I said I'd go over there for Christmas every year. And Christmas every year, I feel like my memory of her was always in the kitchen. Está en la cocina the whole time.
Leave the kitchen, you're constantly just
Man,
feeding the
kitchen.
next kid.
So at the holidays, I'm just like, Lita, like you should sit down. Like, why don't you eat? She's like, no, mija. Like, I'm happy. I'm happy to do this. I remember how tired I was at the end of the night, and I'd fall asleep, and my grandma would still be awake. And then whenever I'd wake up in the morning, my grandma was already awake, sweeping, cleaning, prepping, whatever, doing whatever. I felt like it was really unfair. But when I talked to her about it, she was like, I want to do this. This is how I show the love that I have for my family. So I want to make sure when we're talking about being the strong one, like there's also pride in that part of it too. Like if that is something that is so important to someone, I'm not saying stop doing this. The issue with being the strong one is that sometimes we feel that we have to do it all by ourselves. So
Mm,
in this example, my grandma did it and did it all by herself. Her children don't let her do it anymore. Like my aunts and uncles are like, no, señora, ya siéntese. Like we're not. It's like, abuelita, yay, come sit with us. But it's more of this idea that we can't ask for help because then we're weak, that I want to challenge. I want to challenge that myth and that perception with it. So that was the main goal of it, is understanding that being the strong one doesn't mean that we work without rest, doesn't mean that we are only successful if we don't ask for help, and redefining that we are strong and we ask for help. We are strong and we take breaks. We are strong, and that doesn't mean being strong doesn't mean self-sacrificing.
Yeah, I love that. It's true. It's harder in our society today too, because my mom lived really close to my grandma, who lived close to my tia. So they all lived in communities. They weren't doing it alone. They did it with each other and the family. Whereas now, for example, I live in Denver. My family lives in Florida. And so I truly am alone. And I do have a group of friends, but then I'm like, "Ugh, I don't want to burden my friends with like asking them to babysit my son when I can just get a babysitter. But then I don't know this babysitter y me da ansiedad." And so it's like this mental game that we play that is just like, why can't I just ask my community? Why
Mhm.
can't I just ask my friends? I don't know. I
Yeah.
just can't.
It's like, I don't want to be a burden. And then we go, no quiero quedar mal tampoco. And then it's always all these different obligations. I always encourage people, I'm like, let the other person tell you if they can't. So don't go in with the expectation that they will be available for you, but asking for help is just about you opening up and saying, like, is this something you have the capacity for? Can you help me? And but don't take it personal if they say no, right?
Yeah.
Like you
Yeah.
don't know what's going on for them. That doesn't make them. You're still the same friends you were, and so it's a new world we're navigating.
Good. Thank you for sharing all of that with us, Lisette.
Thank you. I definitely enjoyed being a prima for the day.
If you haven't yet, follow Lisette at the First Gen Psychologist on TikTok. Her content is great. And thanks again, Lisette. We appreciate
Thank you
you.
so much.
Yes, thank you.
Bye, everyone.